I'm sorry, I had the recording turned on. Who was that to join?
This is Elaine Ulrich from DOE Sunshot.
Oh, hi. How are you doing?
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we have Matt Rosenbaum, Caitlin Callahan, Pete Cappers, Lisa Schwartz, and this is Andy Satchwell.
Did somebody else join at the end there? Maybe not. I thought I heard another beep when Elaine announced herself.
Yeah. So do you want to get it going, Caitlin, or do you want to give it a few more minutes for...
No, I think we should get going because I know Matt's got a hard stop.
Okay. All right. So everyone on the phone knows we've got we are recording this. That way, for folks that weren't able to attend today, they can listen to it later. So I'll get started. So this is going to be a briefing to update, mostly for the OE-NED folks, though because this relates to some of the GMLC future work, we wanted to bring in those folks as well. But this is largely a briefing to update you all on where we are with an analysis that's looking at the financial impacts of energy efficiency and net metered PV in combination on a prototypical Northeast utility. A couple of things about this briefing. First of all, these are certainly draft results. We've vetted them internally and are continuing to sort of put together the storyline while also reviewing them to make sure they make sense and that we can explain them. And I'll talk more about sort of where we are in the process of the analysis. I'm going to share some of the draft results with you, and then I've got a second part of the presentation that I wanted to talk you guys through our approach for doing participant, non-participant bill impacts analysis. And that's just sort of a way to share with you where our thinking is, what approach we're going to be using in the report, and we can talk about that as well. I've got about 25 or so slides, so I hope to get through these kind of in the first half, and then we can save the second half for any questions. And certainly feel free to jump in at any time if you guys have some clarifying questions or want to stop me. So with that, I'll start through the presentation. So on the second slide, I think it's important just to provide the context for this analysis. I mean, it's sort of a truism at this point that the utility industry is in the midst of a transformation, and that utilities have expressed publicly concerns about stagnant or declining sales. And a lot of this is attributed to growth in energy savings as well as sort of policy and market-driven customer-sided PV. So this is the sort of resource context for this. We're starting to see regulators and policymakers across the country doing this balancing act between the benefits of efficiency and distributed energy resources to reduce utility costs, reduce customer bills, provide environmental benefits, balancing that with maintaining the utility's financial viability that's really predicated on energy sales. And so any approaches that regulators or policymakers might undertake, whether it's decoupling, rate designs, compensation mechanisms that might improve or maintain the utility's financial viability, may come at the increased cost to customers and potential erosion of those net economic benefits. And so that's the context for what we're doing here. I also want to put this analysis in the context of prior LBNL studies. So this slide 3 sort of presents what I think are 3 distinguishing facets of this analysis. So as compared to prior work, and I actually went back, we've actually published now 10 papers, reports, and articles on our quantitative business models work. And that's all looked at energy efficiency or net metered PV in isolation. So this analysis is looking at combined EE and PV impacts, which is going to develop what we could think about actually as sort of a utility death spiral scenario. So we're looking at rather aggressive EE and PV penetration goals that one could construct sort of a massive, load decline scenario from. We're also looking at participant and non-participant bill impacts. This is a pretty big difference from prior studies that looked at total customer bills. And this enables us to get into some of the more current policy discussions around equity and fairness issues between those who install efficiency in PV and those who don't. And then I think it's also intended to be a representation really of where the Northeast region stands with respect to efficiency in PV. In prior studies, we've looked at specific state efficiency goals or PV penetrations, or even at the utility level. And this is meant to be sort of a more regional Northeast characterization and representation. And this would certainly enable things like, regional technical assistance opportunities. It's a great starting place for a broader group of stakeholders to begin to have these discussions. I've only got 2 slides on the model itself. I think we briefed you guys several times on the Finder model, and I just want to provide sort of a couple of key points about the model that we're using. This model was developed as part of earlier efforts to look at financial impacts of energy efficiency. We started doing this work Pete really started, I guess now about 8 years ago, so we've been doing it for quite some time. We've built up the model over the years. It's just a spreadsheet tool really to look at not only impacts of energy efficiency, but also to look at other distributed energy resources. And this model really just sort of forecasts utility costs and revenues. You make assumptions about what drives those costs and revenues, including regulatory accounting mechanisms and rate making. And you let these resources impact costs and revenues based on the way that we know they impact them. And you can calculate in the end changes to utility profitability and also changes to customer rates and bills. And again, at a high level, slide 5, this is sort of the range of inputs. I think the point here is just to say we take a lot of information as an input to this analysis. It is probably one of the most, robust pro forma financial spreadsheet tools used for public information out there. Utilities have a lot of these internal revenue forecasting models themselves, which makes sense because they have a fiduciary responsibility and they need to know sort of earnings and revenue projections. But this is something we do in the public domain, and it takes into account all of the utilities' costs at a very granular level, and we're able to do rate making at a fairly granular level as well. So sort of mimic what the utility has behind the scenes. And this just gives you a sense of sort of that range of inputs that we use. Maybe the last thing I want to say about the model is on slide 6. So, Caitlin and Matt in particular, you guys have heard us talk about the model enhancements. And I wanted to point out some of the key model enhancements we've done over the past year or so that really makes this analysis possible. So to do the combined impacts of efficiency in PV, we enhanced the model to do hourly modeling. This gives us different impacts and shifts in timing of the utility peak versus those resources, which I'll talk about later in the actual results. We can also apply, some more specific costs to some of the resources for, say like PV integration costs to manage that variable generation. We also made some changes to the model that allow us to do these bill impacts by participant and non-participant and at a customer class level. Again, hourly sales and monthly customer class inputs allows us to do cost of service rate making very similar to how it's actually done in the field, at a residential, commercial, industrial, and sort of other class level accounting. And then the last thing is that we have some more and enhanced mitigation approaches in the model. We were able to enhance the model with some different cost allocation and revenue collection approaches that allows us to do things like residential demand charges or alternative compensation mechanisms for net energy metering. And so that sort of grounds the nerdy modeling work that Pete and I have been doing over the past couple of years in conjunction with E3 as a subcontractor with some of the analysis you're going to see here. Slide 7. So now we get into the storyline of the analysis. So here's the storyline that we're laying out. We have this distribution-only utility in the Northeast United States. It has currently modest savings goals for energy efficiency and net energy metering or NEM compensation mechanism that's eliciting sort of a modest level of customer-sided PV investments. We've got levels that are sort of commensurate with Northeast states as they are today. So you can think about this as sort of a business as usual trajectory. Then we're going to have an introduction, one could say sort of state policymakers themselves decide to introduce policies that strongly support achievement of really aggressive energy efficiency savings goals and PV penetration goals. And we're going to compare then, in our approach, the financial impacts when the utility goes from its existing level of fairly moderate efficiency in PV levels to a more aggressive energy efficiency in PV penetration level. And then we're also going to estimate the efficacy of various rate-making and regulatory approaches that might mitigate any of these negative financial impacts and see to what extent they can actually sort of bring the utility back whole or at least get them fairly close. And then counter that with the impacts on customer rates and bills to see what kind of trade-off there might be there. Today I'm going to go through the first bullet on this slide, which is the financial impacts on sort of the utility as a whole. We won't get into the mitigation stuff, which we can save for a future briefing, but at least this utility level stuff should ground you guys better in the analysis and the approach that we're taking. Did someone just join?
This is Elaine. I'm just having, connection issues.
Okay, all right, sure. Let me know if you need us to repeat anything. So slide 9, so I talked about the efficacy and mitigation approaches. So what, regulatory and rate-making approaches are we going to look at? Slide 9 details the ones that we're going to look at in this analysis. And instead of just coming up with sort of a laundry list of mitigation approaches, we wanted to target these mitigation approaches to specific financial impacts the utility might experience from efficiency and PV in combination. So the first category is that revenue erosion effect. So this is an effect that we've observed in our prior quantitative work, both conceptually as well as some of the state TA that we've done. And this is what happens between rate cases when the utility's revenue collection decreases faster than any change in their costs. And so this is sort of the erosion of their revenue. This is either due to, reduced sales and demand from efficiency or similarly from distributed PV. And so there's several mitigation approaches that can potentially mitigate that impact. That would be revenue per customer decoupling, high residential customer charges, or even demand charges. And so we're going to look at those in isolation for that revenue erosion effect. A separate, though equally important effect to look at is what's called the lost earnings opportunity effect. Another thing we've identified in previous work that talks about as the utility forecasts an expectation of sales and demand going forward, they're going to make capital investments to meet that future growth. Anything that might decrease that expectation of future growth are lost future investments for the utility, and they're going to lose, earnings that they would have otherwise enjoyed on those. So that's that lost earnings opportunity effect, and we attribute that to the avoidance or deferral of capital investments as a result of energy savings from EE or distributed PV. And there are mechanisms, largely shareholder incentive mechanisms, that are meant to mitigate that lost earnings opportunity effect, and we'll look at a performance bonus on program costs for EE, and then some portion of the distributed PV actually being owned by the utility as potential mitigation approaches. And then lastly, we're going to jointly come up with what we're calling a comprehensive approach. So if rate-making approaches in isolation get you part of the way, what if you put together something that addressed both the revenue erosion effect and the lost earnings opportunity effect in a comprehensive way? What would that do to the financial impacts? And so that last comprehensive approach, all of those are being done jointly, whereas the first two columns, we're going to look at those mitigation approaches in isolation. And so that's the approach there. So slide 10, so we're going to define our scenarios. We've got a business as usual scenario and then an aggressive efficiency in PV scenario. In the business as usual scenario, we're assuming 1% of retail sales coming from energy efficiency and 1% of retail sales PV penetration by 2026. We're looking from 2017 to 2026 for this analysis. The aggressive level steps that up to 3.1% of retail sales on the efficiency side, 3.2% of retail sales on the PV penetration side. We get those numbers largely from projections in Massachusetts, which is the most aggressive state in the Northeast in terms of efficiency and distributed solar penetration. So these are very aggressive, though I will say they are grounded in actual forecasts that have been made. And so there is a tie to existing literature out there. We're going to ramp these savings levels up over the first 10 years of the analysis, and then we're going to quantify impacts actually over 20 years, and that might capture any economic end effects, so any of those future cost avoidance or deferrals that would happen in that later 10-year period. Because as we know, efficiency measures have a rather long lifetime, and these PV penetrations, PV systems last for well over 10 years. So we're going to be looking at the direction and magnitude of change when we go from our business as usual to our aggressive scenario, and then the application of these mitigation approaches at that aggressive savings level. So I'm going to now talk about the Northeast utility in its business as usual setting. And this is our starting place. So this modest efficiency in PV saving levels actually result in a slight decline in retail sales and a fairly sort of stagnant or low peak demand growth in this 10 years of the analysis. This is actually not surprising when you look at New England ISO forecasts right now for retail sales growth in the region as a whole in the Northeast. Actually, they're forecasting through 2025 a decline of 0.4% of retail sales. So we're pretty close here with our decline of 0.8%. Again, this is just business as usual without ramping up any of the existing policies. You'll see that as a contribution to reductions in demand, PV accounts for a very small amount of that, and that's really due to this sort of mismatched timing between when the utility peaks and when the PV systems themselves peak in production. This is actually also something that we observe actually out here in California in particular, where you sort of have this misalignment between PV production and utility peak. We'll see the implications of this later on utility costs, but it's important to sort of ground that here in this characterization. Slide 12 shows you the underlying cost growth for this utility. Okay, again, this is in the business as usual, no change to policies going forward. So you can see that the revenue requirement is about $2 billion. It grows to about $2.6 billion in those 10 years. They're going to be making regular capital investments in maintaining the distribution system and adding some amount for any peak demand growth that might be on the system at that sort of 0.8% per year level. Non-fuel costs are growing at about 1.9% per year, and really the cost growth is driven by these supply costs that are growing at about 4.6% per year. You can see those as the light and the dark orange in this slide. It really is sort of the bulk of their revenue requirement and customer supply costs going forward. We also want to talk about how the utility is collecting revenues. So let's ignore the fuel costs and revenues because we're assuming the utility has a fuel adjustment clause. A lot of utilities across the country have this. What that means is that those fuel costs are a direct annual pass-through to customers. So the utility is going to perfectly collect its fuel costs, and customers are going to experience those fuel costs in their entirety in the rates and on the bills. But what we have here is when we think about the non-fuel portion of costs, the utility is going to collect those revenues based on some underlying rate design. And you can see the table in the bottom. We actually looked at an actual utilities cost of service study in the Northeast and built out different rate classes and their rate designs based on that. So the residential class, about 82% of non-fuel revenues come from an energy charge and 18% from customer charges. This is pretty common across the U.S., where you don't have a demand charge in the residential sector and a rather modest customer charge. Commercial and industrial, it's a pretty even split between energy and demand with, again, a small customer charge component. Again, that's pretty typical. And then there's this sort of catch-all street lighting customer class where a lot of it's sort of a fixed, per lamp charge, which would be like a fixed customer charge. As you can see in the graphic, the non-fuel collected revenue is lower than non-fuel costs in every year. So we already see this case where the non-fuel costs are exceeding non-fuel revenue collection prior to moving to more aggressive efficiency in PV levels. Again, this is something that utilities are sort of experiencing already and is part of sort of the policy discussion. But again, as worth pointing out, we tied these rate designs to what an actual Northeast utility has in its cost of service study. So slide 14 gets us into, well, what is the achieved earnings and ROE for this Northeast utility? We're assuming the utility files a rate case every 3 years and has rates that are based on a historic test year with 1 year of regulatory lag. So what that means is that when the utility comes in to file a rate case, they're basing their revenue requirement that's used to set rates on a prior year's costs, that historic test year, and then they have to basically wait until the commission authorizes new rates, and they have to wait a year. So ostensibly, they've got rates that are based on costs that are at least 2 years outdated by the time those new rates take effect. This is, again, something that's very common in application of utility regulation, where you use these sort of historic test year accounting methods, and there's a period of decision and litigation to decide on that new rate design. We find that the result of that, as well as those non-fuel revenues below non-fuel costs, the sort of net effect of all of that is that the utility is under-earning its authorized levels in all years of this analysis. You can see that the authorized levels are those solid bars. The authorized earnings are the black bars. The achieved are the sort of a dark green bar, and that you're seeing ROEs and earnings that are less than what they're authorized. This is, again, not total surprise because utilities often under-earn what they're authorized. So now we get to the point of the story where you have state policymakers and regulators introducing sort of more aggressive energy efficiency savings goals and policies to support more installations of PV, and so higher PV penetration goals. Here I've shown you the sort of 10-year ramp up in the aggressive case. You have an EERS that starts out at 2% and gets to about 3.1% of retail sales over 10 years, and PV penetration at about 1.7% that ramps up to 3.2%. Again, we've tied these to existing forecasts, but these are certainly very aggressive when you look at other parts of the country and in the Northeast region as a whole. So we first want to look at what are the financial impacts of these aggressive efficiency savings and penetration goals on this utility. So we move to slide 16. This gives us that reduction in retail sales and peak demand. It's really stark. So these aggressive efficiency and PV savings levels produce a rather significant decline in utility sales, where they decline at 6.7% per year, and we see peak demand declining at about 0.3% per year. This is a lot of load defection, load destruction, whatever term you want to use, but this is a pretty significant decline for the utility. But we see what this looks like in combination.
Can I ask a question, Andy?
Yeah.
So I have a question about, I'm just trying to look at the shading on the top graph, and it looks like about evenly energy efficiency and PV are reducing
Retail sales.
Yeah, retail sales. And so is that really driven, did you try to sort of hit it that way, or you just, because I'm trying to remember the prior table, where you had even levels of like those penetrations of energy efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Versus PV, sort of. I mean, maybe you could just talk about how it ends up looking perfectly even, the impact.
Yeah. We didn't do it on purpose, which is good, I guess. It actually worked out that way. So the EERS goals are based on, so Massachusetts currently has a pretty aggressive energy efficiency resource standard, as you all may know. And we based the first 2 years here on actual filings that they have. So that matches penetrations that are in their filings, and we sort of scaled those up to reach this 3.1% that we kind of extrapolated out. And then we used Green Tech Media does statewide PV penetration forecast, and we used those for Massachusetts for the PV. And it just so happened that it sort of terminates at a fairly close, which is actually nice for the analysis on the retail sales side, so it's fairly proportional. But the interesting piece is you look at demand impacts, the PV savings have almost no impact on peak demand. And again, this is due to that timing between the hourly production of PV and the timing of the utility's annual peak. And this is, in not to diverge too much, but when you see the valuation literature about what's the sort of value of PV, That's why it declines at higher penetrations. This is stuff that NREL and LBNL have done to show that you have this shift, and this is evident in our modeling here. And we'll see the implications for cost avoidance. Okay, so slide 17. So what are those cost reductions? So we see here on slide 17 that the aggressive efficiency and PV savings on a present value basis reduce the utilities costs by about 11% if we compare that to what their costs were that I showed you for that BAU case. Interestingly, almost all the cost reductions, about 98% of them, are coming from reduced purchase power costs. So really that reduced, you could think of it as the reduced fuel costs and supply costs. So why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with what we showed on that previous slide. So fuel costs are really driven by energy sales. The utility has to go out and procure, in the case of a distribution-only utility, they have to pass through generation costs, market purchases to meet that energy need. Largely, utility costs are based on peak demand. So if you reduce the non-fuel costs, I should say, are based on utility peak demand. So if you reduce that utility's peak demand less than you're otherwise reducing at retail sales, you're sort of proportionally reducing those non-fuel costs by a smaller amount. And we see that here. This is a similar finding that we had to a prototypical Northeast utility when we just looked at net metered PV impacts. And so it does comport with some of the prior research we've done there. So we now have these declines in retail sales and peak demand, which we saw that really drives the revenue collection. Here you can see the decline in different costs for the utility. So now we can sort of compare those reductions and get impacts to the utility shareholders and ratepayers. Slide 18 gives you the reduction in utilities profitability as measured by achieved earnings and ROE. We see that the aggressive scenario reduces achieved earnings by about 35% and achieved ROE by about 35%. They're a few decimal points off, but when we round them to this whole number, we get 35% reduction. So what that translates to is about a $500 million reduction in achieved earnings and a reduction of about 280 basis points or 2.8% on their achieved ROE on average over this 20-year time period. This is because you have much greater reductions in utility revenues as compared to your utility costs. And this is not surprising, right? This is what we've seen before. But the combined impacts are rather stark. This is pretty significant earnings and ROE erosion, certainly more than we've ever seen with efficiency in PV in isolation. We also want to look at what are the customer impacts. So we see that average all-in retail rates increase largely because this Northeast utility is spreading its remaining cost base over a declining sales base. So average all-in retail rate is sort of cents per kilowatt hour, and we see here that goes up by about 34% in this aggressive case. So again, we haven't showed you the mitigation, but just the utility impacts conclusions based on these draft results, I think there's a couple of things to draw here. Certainly at savings levels and penetrations much higher than today, this Northeast utility sees really dramatic reductions in profitability, and the ratepayers also see a really large increase in average all-in retail rates. These are consistent with the direction we've seen in other studies, where earnings and ROE go down with efficiency and PV in isolation, and average retail rates go up. But the magnitudes, again, are much greater than what we've seen. I looked back, we've seen rate increases in the sort of 2 to 3% range, and we've seen sort of earnings and ROE erosion in that similar 2 to 3% range up to 10, 15% in more aggressive cases.
Andy, on the second bullet, can you remind us of the time frame for this 34% increase?
Yeah. So that's on average over 20 years.
So how would that comport on an annual basis given compounding? You know?
It's tough to say because our metric includes a discount factor to bring that average back to the forward.
Okay.
So it would be proportional per year.
That's something that you might cover in the report.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll definitely put that in as a metric. That's a good way to discern it. And I think the last thing to mention is that the remaining analytical approach is going to ask whether we have existing regulatory and rate-making approaches that exist today and have been deployed for efficiency in PV that could mitigate these negative impacts. So would they be enough to mitigate this rather significant earnings and ROE erosion, and what would be the potential trade-off for customer rates? So let me stop right there with this first part and see if there's any questions that folks have on the call.
I'm all set.
Okay.
I don't know if others have questions, but I figured somebody should break the silence so you knew we were still here.
I'm gonna just warm people up by asking one more question. So you assume the historical test year, and in reality, it varies among states what adjustments are actually allowed in the historical test year. So you're in a way sort of looking at the most, I don't want to say extreme, but like it's sort of one bookend, version of it. So I don't know, not included in your list, and I'm not trying to add to your list.
Yeah.
You don't include future test year on the list, but do you think your report might cover, for example, some of the adjustments, just, in terms of tax, some of the adjustments that some states make to historical test years so that stuff doesn't really look this bad, even for the base year, right? The reference case, before you, things go to hell. And also, might you cover, a little bit about how a future test year could be a mitigation strategy?
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't dump it into the mitigation approaches really because, and we don't intend to cover it in depth in the report, because changing the sort of the test year in a state, as you know, Lisa, is fraught with all sorts of legal and political challenges.
And is illegal in some states.
And is illegal in some states. That said, and it's not. That said, it is part of the discussions, right? And it's sort of, especially this movement to forward test years. I think it really helps us explain some of the results we see, like here on. I went back to slide 13. You see this sort of seesaw effect in the non-fuel collected revenues. That's the impact of new rates taking effect. Utilities know it. Well, most everybody in the industry knows it or should know it. If you move to a forward test year, you would potentially either smooth this line out or bring those non-fuel collected revenues closer to the non-fuel costs, because you have more contemporaneous timing between when you collect that revenue and when those costs are incurred. So it would really improve the earnings and probably reduce the impacts that we see from the aggressive efficiency in PV. But we're not planning to quantify it, but it helps explain certainly some of the results we see here.
And certainly gives you more frequent rate cases. And in many states, we see those instead of every 3 years, which is your assumption, we see it, much more frequently. Yeah.
Though other states much less frequently.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whatever works for the utility.
Right.
So, hey, this is Elaine. I'm not exactly sure where to start with this question, but in looking at this, I know that what you're looking at are the impacts on the utility specifically, but I guess I'm just wondering if there's a way to better quantify just where all the money goes. So if you had some assumptions, for example, of like on the net metering side or on the energy efficiency side, again, consumers may have debt that they're paying off. Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, there's this money that's sort of still in the economy, but where is it? So I understand that this is like here's what this is doing specifically to the utility. But in terms of what the actual impacts are to the consumers, in terms of, whether or not they're achieving savings and whether it's reducing overall costs within the economy, or where that money sort of ends up. Again, whether it's a difference in financing rate because maybe consumers are paying more than the utility, or vice versa, or some of those. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems like it might be possible to sort of follow the money a little bit better on this in a way that paints a more complete picture, so you can actually get more of a sense of, greater economic impacts outside of just to the utility. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's certainly, I mean, maybe it's worth spending a moment talking about these two effects that drive the utility financial impacts, this revenue erosion and lost earnings opportunity, and what those really do represent. Because I think what you're suggesting is definitely correct, that this, a dollar less for the utility doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. So when you think about the revenue erosion effect, this is really the utility collecting less revenue, but that means that that's for every dollar less that they're collecting, that's a dollar less than customers are paying. And so I think that's certainly part of the equation. I'll actually get to that in the second part when we talk about bill impacts. So we are able to account for that in the model sort of in that regard. The lost earnings opportunity effect, again, those are sort of lost future earnings that the utility would have otherwise enjoyed. This is a bit of a harder one to follow through because that presumes the utility, you were going to meet they were going to get their forecasted investments over time. You've reduced those investments, and so here's the delta. Where do those dollars go? They go all across the economy to the project developers, for jobs, for whatever. Our model can't really sort of account for that necessarily. Now that also gets reflected in bill savings because those are costs that the customers didn't have to otherwise pay. So they'll get picked up in the bill savings. But when we think about sort of the macroeconomic impacts, as you're suggesting, that needs to be taken into account, but our model can't do that.
Right, and I'm just wondering if there's a way to just describe a few of those things for context.
Yeah.
Because I think that it is important to sort of have that bigger picture and to describe what some of that might be. And again, I don't know that you can necessarily estimate what those are, or if it makes sense within this particular study to talk about what some of those percentages might look like. Again, because if some of it's just money that consumers will not have spent, then that's great. And again, as you mentioned, some of it could be jobs to others that are still in energy areas. So, like ESPCs and things like this. For many people, they would kind of say, okay, if it's going to an ESPC or a utility, either way, they're an energy service provider. And in some ways, there are some utilities who provide those kinds of services or who are moving into business models that look like that. And so I think that's potentially some valuable context to have.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. We'll be sure to include that in there. And this is also important to differentiate. Our report is intended to provide information for, deepen the understanding, and sort of build the capabilities of regulators and policymakers to discuss these issues. But they've got a very hard balancing act because it's not just about maintaining utility financial viability. That may come at the expense of other things. And I think you definitely pointed out that bigger picture to take into account. So, we'll include that for sure. I would definitely be dubious of someone that said they could definitively quantify those impacts, at some point. But it's worth talking through at least qualitatively.
Guys, this is David Meyer. I came in late, so you may have addressed this earlier. I noticed that the discussion that I've seen here all pertains to the Northeast. Have you done comparable analysis for the Southwest, or is that still to be done? And do you expect somewhat similar magnitudes of impact in the Southwest?
It's a great question. So we haven't started the Southwest report. We're going to do that after the Northeast one is finished. It will follow we're planning for it to follow a very similar analytical approach, so then it can be really more a discussion about the sort of financial and operating characteristic differences of the utilities instead of taking a sort of wholesale different analytical approach. What do we expect? Well, this is totally conjecture at this point, so it's a good thing we're recording this.
I was going to say, do you want to turn off the recording at this point? Or?
We'll see. This will be interesting to compare later. Sort of based on work we've done for regulators in Arizona and Nevada and some of the prototypical Southwest utility stuff we've done, I would believe the direction of change will be similar. We'll see similar reductions in achieved earnings and ROE, and we'll see similar increase in terms of direction for average retail rates. I imagine the magnitudes will be different. When we talk about these two effects, this revenue erosion effect and the lost earnings opportunity effect, for a distribution-only utility, that lost earnings opportunity effect is rather small because they're not making large generating investments. They're not making large transmission investments. They're a distribution-only utility, and so their incremental capex is smaller. Whereas the Southwest utility, we're going to presume is an investor or vertically integrated, would have much higher.
Okay.
So that's probably a big difference right there. How much of a change? I don't know if I really. It'll be interesting to compare. I'll say that much.
Well, again, because I came in midstream. Will the slides be that you use today? Will they be available? I know not for distribution, but just within the group here, are they available?
Yeah, I sent them out.
Okay.
David, I'll check to make sure you're on the email, and if not, forward them to you.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
And Elaine, I'll want to get your email address too, so I can send you the deck.
I can send them to Elaine
Thank
as
you.
well.
Okay.
That would be great. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So let's just move on and sort of wrap things up with the bill impacts analysis logic. Again, let me sort of say a few things about the bill impact. So again, this report really takes the next step beyond what we've done in prior studies. In prior studies, we've said in aggregate across the entire utility, total customer bills change by X. And typically in the studies we've done, we've seen that total customer utility bills are reduced with energy efficiency and net meter PV. This is simply because while average retail rates may increase, you have a really a similar decline in the sales or peak demand that are used to collect that revenue. So collected revenue is a customer bill. Any reduction in collected revenues is a reduction in customer bills, and you see that across the utility as a whole. We're going to look at participants and non-participants. So we're going to break out those customer bill impacts between two important groups. Okay. So I'm going to walk through the logic that we've developed. I'm doing this because we've improved on what's been done prior. We put a lot of thought into this, and I wanted to show you sort of the assumptions we're making going into this and answer any questions you guys have about it. When we talk about customer bills, it's just a price times a quantity. So for each customer, your bill is going to be some price that's determined by the costs of the utility spread over the different billing determinants. But you have this price that's determined in our analysis through total portfolio impacts. Any price is going to be the same for all customers within a class, whether you participate in a program or not. If your neighbor installs a CFL and you don't, you pay the same rate, per kWh rate on your bill. But it's the quantity that differs between participants and non-participants. And that quantity is determined net of energy efficiency and PV savings for participants only. And we also know that this is going to differ by customer class, which is one of the benefits of having these sort of model enhancements at a customer class level. We can drill down to that layer as well. And so we're going to derive these customer bills for participants, and we're going to derive these customer bills for non-participants. Again, the rate or the price stays the same no matter whether you participate or not, but it's that quantity that changes, and we want to drill into that a little bit. Why do we do this? It's certainly not some esoteric analysis. It is important because customers who install efficiency measures or PV systems are going to see greater bill reductions than non-participating customers, all else being equal, because they're reducing their energy consumption. These impacts are important for regulators because it tells you how those bill savings are distributed amongst all of the customers within a class and begins to reveal some information about fairness and equity as that regulator or policymaker thinks about how should future costs be allocated to these different groups of customers and who may or may not be paying a proportional or more than or less than proportional share of those costs. We're not going to definitively answer fairness and equity in this report. nor do I ever think we're going to definitively answer that. But I certainly think this sheds light and is a really important step in that direction, and it's something that regulators are beginning to ask for. So let's start by walking through the logic. So how can you define participation? I think there's really three approaches one could take. You could assume between efficiency and PV participants, there is no overlap. So I just have EE participants and I just have PV participants. PV participants don't install EE measures and EE participants don't install PV systems. Option number two, you could go to the opposite extreme and sort of say, I've got only dual participation. So my participants install both efficiency measures and PV systems. The other option is sort of a complicated Venn diagram to think about it. You have some independent participation and you have some overlapping participation. So you could sort of define your participants any way. The common way to do it, the way we're going to do it because it's more analytically straightforward and allows us to drill into some really important impacts without getting caught in assumption land, is to take this first approach to assume no dual participation. We're going to clearly acknowledge that this isn't necessarily the case, and that there are lots of co-benefits PV participants can get from installing EE measures because they don't have to pay for as large of a system. And certainly EE participants can have co-benefits from installing PV systems. But for the purposes of our analysis, we're going to assume no dual participation. So as we talk about these groups, think of them as distinct groups. But if you sum the non-participants, the EE participants, and the PV participants, you should get to the total number of customers within a class. The next thing that we need to think about is what do we assume about the diversity of participants? There's been limited analysis of this type to date. There have been very few studies that have been done to try and understand the bill impacts of efficiency participants and non-participants, and similarly on the PV side, in fact, even fewer on the PV side. Most of them have assumed no diversity of participants. When we thought about it, especially on the efficiency side, we wanted to think about making sort of an advancement in that approach and think about, as compared to an average customer, does an EE participant sort of differ? And we think they do, actually. And it really comes down to what's the program they participate in. There's a big difference in both savings levels and consumption even prior to installing that efficiency measure when you think about someone who signs up for a lighting program or takes, sort of installs that CFL, as compared to somebody that does a whole home retrofit program or low-income programs or new construction programs. That distribution of impacts and distribution of customers is really broad. However, on the PV side, when we think about an average customer system as compared to that average customer, we don't think that distribution, or we haven't seen the data that suggests that that distribution is really, really broad. And so we're going to assume that we're going to provide EE participant impacts by program type, and PV participant impacts are just going to simply be whether or not they install a system. Net energy metering is sort of incents you to design your system to meet your load. And so if the average customer system is roughly the same size as the average customer, then we don't have to assume that diversity. Again, I recognize that this diversity probably exists, but we've just sort of tried to make this incremental improvement on prior methodologies. So the last two slides, I'm just going to walk you through the bill logic. I find these things helpful. This may actually be more confusing, but we'll sort of try and go through it. Any customer's bill is a sum of your energy, demand, and customer charge portions. Okay? Customer charge isn't going to change whether or not you participate, and it won't change on how much you consume. Energy and demand portion of the bill will. And so you can see here for the PV participant, we're just going to apply that price, that energy, demand, or customer rate, times consumption, energy consumption or demand consumption after you've netted out the PV savings. It's pretty straightforward, sort of comports with standard logic. The last slide shows you this additional layer. I think this is a really cool addition that we've done here. We've taken what existed in Finder with that PV participant logic, given the diversity of EE participants, we've sort of layered on this additional element, which is going to be able to say not only what does the EE participants' bill look like, but what's the diversity among different types of programs that they might participate in, whether, again, it's whole home retrofit, lighting and appliance rebates, low income, that kind of stuff. And so we can sort of do further allocations here in the green that allows us to, ultimately roll back up into that total bill, but gives us that additional layer of granularity to represent that diversity. So that is it. I realize we're really coming up against time here, but want to see if there's any sort of last-minute questions, and certainly you guys can feel free to reach out to Pete and myself for any follow-up. It was definitely a whirlwind, so it may be totally overwhelming.
It was a good whirlwind.
Good.
I think what the context actually is going to be really helpful when we look at the report. That's probably when we'll actually have questions for you.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, and so, I mean, with that, Pete and I are intending to get a draft into Chuck and Lisa's hands in the month of June.
Sure.
We want to do, obviously because this touches on fairly new areas, we're going to want to do a pretty thorough sort of internal vetting, and we've actually already got some folks vetting some of our efficiency assumptions. And so, yeah, so the hope is to get that into their hands and then turn around and get you guys a copy before we send it out for peer review.
Okay. Sounds good. Are you guys going to send out a link of some sort to the webinar that you recorded?
Yeah.
Or do you want to do that? You want to wait till people ask for information?
No, that's fine. I can follow up with a link to this, actually. Might as well.
Whatever's easier. I just wanted to make sure if other people who couldn't make it, we knew what to tell them about the link or about the link.
Tell them that a link is forthcoming. It'll probably take me. I'm really bad at figuring out what to do after I hit the record button and then stop record. So I'll talk with some folks here and get something I can send out.
Fair enough. All right. Well, just let us know what we need to tell people, or
okay.
Just send out an email. We'll just let folks know that you'll follow up.
Okay, that's great. Any other questions before we finish up?
I don't have any.
Okay.
But thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for your time, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
It was really fascinating.